In the quiet folds of the Himalayan foothills, where snow-fed rivers cut silver threads through emerald valleys and mist clung to the mountains like a sacred veil, lay a village untouched by time. It was the kind of place where the sun rose not with fanfare, but with reverence, spilling golden light over terraced fields carved by hand, and where the caw of ravens and the low hum of prayer wheels marked the rhythm of the day. Here, the air was thin but pure, laced with the scent of pine, smoke from clay hearths, and the sharp sweetness of rhododendron in bloom. The world beyond seemed distant, almost irrelevant, yet the people who lived here had always shaped its history in quiet, resolute ways. From this soil, hardened by frost and softened by rain, grew men not raised in wealth but steeped in honor. One such son was Bahadur Rana. He was born under the shadow of the great peaks, in a mud and stone house where warmth came not from luxury, but from the closeness of family. His mother, a strong, soft-spoken woman with deep eyes like mountain lakes, worked the fields barefoot and prayed every dawn without fail. His father, Dev Bahadur, was a living legend in their village, a man who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Tommies in the trenches of the Somme, who had stared death in the face and returned home missing an arm but never his dignity. Dev Bahadur never spoke of his wounds. Instead, he spoke of loyalty, of carrying a comrade through shellfire, of the strength in silence and the power of a soldier's word. His stories were not about glory. They were about grit, about holding the line when others fell back, about offering water to a dying enemy, about laughing in the mud so others wouldn't cry. To the boys of the village, he was a hero. To Bahadur, he was simply Baba. Bahadur grew up beneath that example, internalizing a code of quiet strength. As a child, he watched his father carve wooden tools with one hand and still outwork younger men. He watched him give grain to neighbors, even in lean years, and teach the value of discipline not with blows, but with stories and patient correction. The old man would point to the hills and say, "The mountain never shouts, but it stands taller than all." At the village school, a one-room affair with slate boards and chalk dust, Bahadur was not the most talkative, but his teachers saw a kind of calm in him that set him apart. He was thoughtful, respectful, always the first to stand when an elder entered the room. He had his father's eyes, steady, deep-set, always scanning the horizon, as if waiting for a storm only he could sense. Other boys played games and fought with sticks. Bahadur trained himself. He ran up the steepest trails, carrying baskets of stone to build his strength. He studied maps borrowed from the schoolmaster, learned the stories of great battles, not to revel in war, but to understand it. In his heart, he carried a calling. When recruiters came to the village, tall men in crisp khakis, medals gleaming in the sun, the air would change. The elders gathered, drums were beaten, a hush fell over the village square. Boys dreamed of distant lands, of uniforms and honor and something larger than themselves. Gurkhas, they were called, warriors of legend, their kukris curved like the crescent moon, their loyalty unwavering. To wear the Gurkha badge was to become part of something eternal. Bahadur stood before the recruiters barefoot, his back straight, his arms behind him. They asked him why he wanted to join. He answered simply, "To serve." The officer, a veteran himself, studied him and saw something familiar in the boy's bearing. Not bravado, but belief. Not arrogance, but steel. He passed the trials, running, shooting, enduring, with quiet determination. When others stumbled, Bahadur gritted his teeth and pressed on. When pain came, he smiled. "The body breaks," he once told a fellow recruit, "but the spirit chooses whether to kneel." His acceptance into the Gurkhas was not a celebration of pride, it was a continuation of duty. His mother wept, pressing his hand to her forehead. His father said nothing, but on the day Bahadur left, he placed his old service medal in his son's palm and said, This isn't yours yet. You must earn your own. Thus, Bahadur Rana, son of farmers, bearer of mountains, stepped into history not with a roar, but with the quiet confidence of those who know who they are. He left behind his home, his family, and the gentle rhythm of village life, and walked toward the fire that awaited across distant oceans. What he did not know was that fate would soon test him, not in the ranks of thousands, but in the space between life and death, between fear and courage, between one man and 35 armed enemies. And when that test came, the boy who grew up listening to stories of duty would become one of those stories himself. From an early age, Bahadur Rana understood something most grown men took a lifetime to learn: that strength was not just a matter of flesh and bone, but of heart. True strength, he was taught, came from within. It was not measured by how loudly a man spoke or how fiercely he struck, but by how quietly he endured, how deeply he believed, and how unflinchingly he stood when others turned away. Before dawn broke over the snow-capped Himalayas, while the world still slept and stars shimmered above like ancient watchmen, Bahadur's day would begin. He rose in silence, wrapping a wool shawl around his shoulders to shield himself from the biting mountain chill. Then, barefoot and steady, he would slip out of the stone house and into the embrace of the forest. The trails, tangled with roots and hidden stones, were unforgiving. Yet he welcomed the pain. With every step, he imagined he was training not for today, but for something far away, something that only the bravest dared to dream of. He ran with purpose. The pine needles underfoot, the chirping of waking birds, the thin air that made lesser lungs burn, these were his companions. He pushed himself harder with each passing day, as if each mile brought him closer to his destiny. Sometimes he carried stones in a sling across his back. Other times he practiced stealth, moving like a shadow between trees, learning the rhythm of nature until he could pass through without disturbing a single branch. Then came the river. Fed by distant glaciers, the river below his village was a steel-gray ribbon of freezing water. Its current was strong, its depths deceptive. Villagers avoided it in the early morning cold. Bahadur dove in head first. The shock of the icy water gripped his chest like a vice, but he didn't scream. He swam hard, against the flow, sometimes for minutes at a time without rest, his breath measured, his strokes powerful. He imagined he was crossing rivers on some distant battlefield, with bullets in the air and lives on the line. When he emerged, dripping and shivering, the cold no longer stung. It baptized him. It made him stronger. Back home, after drying himself with rough cloth and wrapping in his father's old army blanket, he would take up his wooden stick, a carved replica of a kukri, the iconic curved blade of the Gurkhas, and begin his drills. With slow, deliberate movements, he practiced every form his father had taught him. The blade slashed, circled, guarded. He danced with it in silence, letting his body memorize the flow of attack and defense, of motion and stillness. The stick was only wood, but in Bahadur's hands it carried weight and meaning. To him, it was not a toy. It was a promise. In the mornings, his mother watched from the threshold of their home. Her face, weathered by sun and years of toil, remained calm. She never interfered, never told him to stop, though each time she clasped her hands together and whispered a silent prayer to the gods. She had already given one man, her husband, to war. In her heart, she knew she was preparing to give another, but she did not hold him back. She understood, in the way only mothers can, that her son's path was not hers to shape. She could only offer him strength, love, and prayer. And then there was Lali, his little sister, barely past her 5th monsoon, followed Bahadur like a shadow. She had eyes like black almonds and a spirit like a firecracker, curious, wild, and full of questions. While the other children of the village played with pebbles or sang songs beneath banyan trees, Lali watched her brother train. She sat cross-legged on the edge of the field, her chin in her hands, marveling at how her dai moved like a tiger through the tall grass. Sometimes she would sneak up behind him and shout, "Got you!" hoping to catch him off guard, but Bahadur always turned with a smile, scooping her up with one arm and spinning her in the air until she giggled like a bubbling stream. "You're going to fight bad men someday, aren't you?" she'd ask, wide-eyed. "Only if I must," Bahadur would reply gently. "But you'll win, right?" He would nod, tapping the tip of her nose. "Not because I'm strong, Lali, but because I won't give up." She would beam at him then, hugging him tightly. "Dai, you're not just my brother," she'd say with the fierce certainty of a child. "You're a lion." Bahadur never forgot those words. He carried them in the quiet places of his heart, like a talisman. Whenever he faltered, whenever his muscles ached or doubts whispered at the edge of his thoughts, he remembered Lali's voice. Her belief in him was pure, unshakable. And in that belief, he found something more powerful than courage. He found purpose. So every morning, before the first rooster crowed and the village came alive, Bahadur trained in the cold. He bled from cuts he didn't show. He cried tears that fell where no one could see. He grew, not just in strength, but in soul. The world had yet to hear his name, but the mountains already knew it. The wind whispered it through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, fate waited, sharpening its edge, preparing to call him forward. Because Bahadur Rana was not destined to live a quiet life among the fields. He was born of warriors, and soon the world would know what it meant when a lion from the hills stood his ground. When Bahadur turned 18, he didn't throw a party or announce his coming of age with noise. Instead, as the first snow melted from the terraced hills of his village, he tied his father's old army belt around his waist, packed a small cloth satchel with dried lentils and rice, kissed his mother's weathered hands, and quietly set off down the mountain path. The earth beneath his feet had raised him. Now it was time to repay it, with service, with steel, and if necessary, with blood. It was a 2-day journey on foot to the British recruiting post. He passed rivers swollen with snowmelt, bridges made of rope and prayer, and villages where elders sat chewing betel and staring at the horizon. Some nodded at him in silent approval. They saw it in the way he walked, shoulders straight, head high, heart ready. This boy was not walking to a job. He was answering a call. When Bahadur finally arrived at the post, the Union Jack fluttered wearily in the wind above a wooden building built into the slope of a ridge. Inside sat a British officer, tired and red-faced, sipping tea that had long gone cold. He'd seen many recruits, some eager, others frightened. But when Bahadur stepped into the room quiet as dawn and twice as steady, the officer looked up and paused. There was something in the boy's eyes, not arrogance, not bravado, but calm, a quiet strength, the kind that didn't need proving. He studied Bahadur a moment longer, then smiled. "You'll make a fine Gurkha," he said simply. And so it began. Training was not for the weak. It was designed to break a man, then remake him in iron. The young men crawled on their bellies through thorn-choked ravines under the midday sun, carried sandbags up hills until their shoulders bled, and learned to sleep standing up in rain-soaked barracks with rats for company. They were taught to shoot, to march, to kill. But more than that, they were taught discipline, brotherhood, purpose. Many grumbled. Some faltered, but not Bahadur. He didn't speak much. He didn't joke or complain. When others cursed the leeches that latched onto their legs during jungle crawls, Bahadur stayed silent and focused. He treated pain like a teacher, discomfort like a friend. His eyes held the same calm fire they'd always had, like glowing embers beneath snow. At night, when the others collapsed onto their mats, groaning, Bahadur would take out his wooden kukri and run his drills alone in the moonlight, cutting arcs through the air like a dancer rehearsing a deadly ballet. One of the British sergeants watched from afar once and whispered to another, "That one's different. He doesn't fight for glory. He fights because he must." And then the war came crashing down like a monsoon. The year was 1942. The world was bleeding. The Japanese war machine, fierce and relentless, had swept through Malaya and Singapore, and now it rolled like a thundercloud into the jungles of Burma. The British Empire trembled on the edge, and when the call came for the best to be sent forward, Bahadur and his unit, seasoned, hardened, and ready, were chosen. They were flown in transport planes that bucked and roared like angry bulls through turbulent skies, then dropped into the vast green hell of Burma. It was nothing like the hills of Nepal. It was wet, choking, alive with death. The air was heavy with decay. Mosquitoes as large as bullets tore into the flesh. Snakes slithered beneath sleeping rolls. The humidity was a second skin, thick and suffocating. And worse still, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The Japanese soldiers were disciplined, tenacious, and knew the jungle like wolves. But Bahadur was not afraid. In fact, he seemed to grow stronger here, in this brutal, unforgiving world. He moved with the jungle. His steps made no sound. His presence left no trace. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, only to reappear behind enemy lines, striking with his blade and vanishing before a scream could rise. He walked like a shadow. He moved like a ghost, and when he fought, he struck like thunder. His unit came to rely on him in ways no one spoke aloud. He was not the loudest, not the highest ranked. But when night fell and the jungle came alive with whispers and warnings, eyes would instinctively turn to Bahadur. If he was calm, they were calm. If he moved forward, they followed. If he paused, they waited. There was one patrol, long, dangerous, deep into Japanese territory, where Bahadur's instincts saved them all. They had been moving single file through a narrow trail when he suddenly raised a hand. No sound, no warning, just a stillness. The others froze behind him. A heartbeat later, a tripwire trap was spotted, hidden beneath leaves. Had they walked forward, the entire squad would have been torn apart. No one said anything. But that night, a fellow Gurkha gave him the last of his tobacco as a silent gesture of respect. It was in this furnace of war that Bahadur earned his place. Not through ceremony, but through deeds. By carrying a wounded comrade for 6 miles through enemy-infested jungle, by refusing to leave a position until every last round had been fired, by standing between his unit and a Japanese machine gun nest, giving cover long enough for others to flank and destroy it. He did not shout. He did not boast. He simply acted. And the jungle whispered his name. Bahadur Rana, Lion of the Hills, Ghost of Burma. And soon that name would echo through a battle where the odds were 35-1, and the outcome would become legend. It was near dusk when Bahadur and 3 fellow Gurkhas slipped silently into the dripping jungle, the air thick with humidity and the scent of wet earth. The mission was simple on paper: reconnaissance, a silent approach, an observation, and a quiet return. But war was never that clean. The rain fell in sheets, cutting across their skin like needles, and the jungle, dense, wild, and ancient, closed in around them like a living thing. Each breath was drawn through clenched teeth. Each step was a prayer. The Japanese position was close, too close. Bahadur could feel it in his bones. An electric tension in the air, like the jungle itself, was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the night was torn apart. A sudden blinding flash, a violent thunderclap of metal and death, a grenade thrown by unseen hands. It landed no more than a few feet from them, too close to run, too close to scream. The explosion rocked the earth. Bahadur was thrown backward into a muddy hollow, the air ripped from his lungs, his ears ringing with the high-pitched whine of shock. Time warped into a slow, horrifying crawl. He blinked. His ears picked up something over the ringing, moans, then silence. Two of his brothers were gone, blown apart, their bodies no longer recognizable, twisted into the dark soil. The third, a young man named Nima, was crying out in agony, clutching his stomach, blood gushing between his fingers. Then he went still, a light extinguished. Bahadur tried to move, but pain surged through him like fire. He looked down. His left hand was a mangled ruin. Two fingers dangled by threads of skin torn apart by shrapnel. Blood poured from the wound. His left eye throbbed with blinding pain, and when he touched his face, he felt shards of metal embedded in his brow and cheek. He couldn't see from that eye anymore, just darkness and blood. But he was still alive. He dragged himself into a shallow depression in the earth, half trench, half crater, clutching his Lee Enfield rifle in his one good hand. The rain had turned the mud into a cold soup, and he could feel the earth sucking at his legs as he burrowed in. The pain was immense, every heartbeat sending lightning bolts through his arm and skull. But Bahadur didn't cry out. He gritted his teeth and bit down on the corner of his uniform to muffle the sound of his own breath. Then he heard them. Footsteps, dozens. Soft at first, slipping, splashing, trudging through the jungle brush. Japanese voices rose and fell, commanding, cursing, calling out to one another. They were sweeping the area, looking for confirmation, for bodies, for silence. And when they found what was left of Bahadur's team, they assumed their work was done. The Japanese soldiers began to set up camp, barely 20 meters away. Lanterns flickered in the rain. A few men laughed. Rifles were stacked in neat pyramids. A kettle was placed over a fire. Someone began cleaning a machine gun, muttering in a low voice. Bahadur didn't move, didn't breathe. From his muddy hollow, half conscious and half dead, he counted them, one by one. 35. 35 Japanese soldiers, against one bleeding, blinded Gurkha with 9 working fingers and a rifle. A sane man would have waited, hoped for rescue, or maybe used the cover of darkness to slip away. But Bahadur wasn't thinking of escape. He wasn't thinking of himself. His thoughts were of his fallen comrades, of the mission, of honor, of duty. His father's voice echoed in his mind. A warrior does not measure odds. He measures right and wrong. He tightened his grip on the rifle. The mud clung to his body like a shroud. The pain was a drumbeat in his skull, but his breath steadied. He watched. He waited. Each second passed like a century. He knew the terrain, the angles, the way sound moved through wet jungle. He could predict where they would walk, where they would sit, how they would talk. This was no longer their battlefield. It was his hunting ground. He was not surrounded. They were. And before the sun would rise again, Bahadur Rana would show them what one Gurkha could do. He could have laid still. He could have waited to die. But a fire burned inside him, the fire of his ancestors, the echo of his father's stories, the prayers of his mother, the smile of his sister. He was a Gurkha. As night fell, the jungle grew darker than death. The Japanese soldiers, confident, lowered their guard. That was their mistake. Bahadur tore a piece of cloth from his uniform and tied it around his wounded hand. With his remaining fingers, he loaded his rifle. He checked his grenades, and then he waited. Just past midnight, when the camp was at its quietest, Bahadur began his assault. The first grenade flew silently into the center of the camp. An explosion, screams, panic. Before the echo faded, his rifle spoke, sharp, controlled shots. 1, 2, 3 down, then another grenade, more confusion. The enemy thought they were under a full-scale attack. He moved like a ghost, shooting from different angles, using the jungle as his shield. The Japanese fired wildly into the dark, hitting trees and shadows. Bahadur slipped behind them, grabbed a fallen soldier's bayonet, and in close combat became a whirlwind. With his kukri in one hand, he fought like a man possessed. His eyes saw only survival. His blade knew only duty. By dawn, the jungle was silent again. 35 soldiers had entered that camp. Only one man stood. Bloodied, barely conscious, his uniform torn, Bahadur leaned on his kukri like it was a walking stick. His breaths were shallow, but his heart still beat like a war drum. British forces found him hours later, surrounded by bodies. At first, they thought he was dead. But then he opened his eye and whispered, "I'm still here." His survival shocked everyone. His story traveled faster than any bullet. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor, but when asked how he did it, he simply said, "A Gurkha doesn't think of odds. We only think of duty."